At 18, Imani Carter, a bright young black girl, found herself caught in an unimaginable nightmare when she was falsely accused by police. Earlier that day, she had been walking home with dreams of her future at Howard University dancing in her mind. Now, with the harsh command, "Hands up, don't move," slicing through the cool evening air, she froze, staring down the barrels of police guns. In that instant, the shock in the courtroom and the stunned silence of onlookers were palpable. Everyone in the courtroom was left speechless when Imani, in a desperate bid to prove her innocence, flashed her CIA internship badge. The moment she raised that small but significant card, the tension in the room shifted, and the entire system seemed to quiver in disbelief. Just moments before this dramatic encounter, Imani had been an honor student, finishing her senior year at Benjamin Banner High School. She had recently been accepted at Howard University on a generous scholarship, her dream college, nestled in the heart of the city she loved. It was early April, and she had plans to celebrate her acceptance with her mother that evening, perhaps even treating Diana, her beloved mother, to dinner at a local family restaurant. Instead, fate intervened that fateful afternoon when Imani, having stayed after school for an emergency meeting of the debate club, boarded the number 7 bus. This bus, which zigzagged through some of the busiest streets in Northwest Washington, D.C., was a familiar routine for her. Imani always carried a backpack loaded with thick textbooks on physics, calculus, and U.S. government, as well as a separate pouch that housed her laptop. Tucked discreetly in a hidden compartment of that pouch was a small identification badge bearing her name, Imani Carter, and embossed with the unmistakable crest of the CIA. She had received that badge only a few months earlier, marking the final step before her enrollment in an extended summer training program. The bus ride itself was uneventful, filled with sleepy students, office workers, and exhausted parents heading home. Imani disembarked near Brightwood, planning to walk the remaining few blocks as dusk approached. The sky was painted in soft shades of pinkish orange, and the sun was slowly descending beyond the horizon. That was when everything changed. Around the corner from where she stood, 3 police cars converged in front of a run-down convenience store, a store Imani had often passed on her way home. Their flashing lights cast harsh reds and blues across the alleyway, creating a disorienting strobing effect that made her stomach clench. Even from a distance, Imani sensed that something was terribly amiss. The posture of the officers and the rising, angry shouts in the background confirmed her unease. Though she could not make out every word, it was clear that a disturbance was unfolding. Cautiously, she tried to skirt around the chaos, hoping to avoid any confrontation. Before she could disappear behind the next block, a sharp voice shouted, "Hey you, stop right there!" Imani froze, unsure if the command was directed at her. A second, more insistent call followed. "You, girl in the hoodie, hands up!" In that moment, her heart hammered in her chest. Dressed in a worn black hoodie, jeans, and with her backpack casually slung over one shoulder, there was nothing unusual about her appearance. Yet, fear pulsed through her veins as she slowly raised her hands, eyes darting around, searching for anyone who might intervene on her behalf. A few onlookers stationed at a distance began recording the unfolding scene on their phones. 2 police officers approached, their hands already hovering near the grips of their sidearms. The older officer, whose name tag read O'Donnell, glared at her as he demanded, "What are you doing here?" Imani's voice trembled as she stuttered, I'm just heading home. I live a few blocks away." The younger officer, identified as Marston, interjected, "We're looking for suspects in a robbery that took place earlier today. You match the description." Confusion washed over Imani. She had been in school all day, and many of her teachers and classmates could vouch for her whereabouts. Yet, Officer O'Donnell's voice grew harsh as he snapped, "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." Panic clawed at her chest. Imani wanted nothing more than to assert her rights, but she recalled her mother's stern warnings about dealing with the police. Keep your voice steady, do not make sudden moves, and never argue, as to you be deemed a threat. She nodded mutely, and in an instant Officer Marston yanked her arms behind her back, swiftly cuffing her wrists tighter than necessary. Imani winced in pain as O'Donnell began a quick search of her backpack. He rifled through her physics textbook, her lunch container, and a notebook filled with debate club notes until he discovered the laptop pouch. With a sudden motion, he pried it open, and his brow furrowed at the sight of her CIA internship badge. "What is this?" he demanded, holding up the small ID card as if it were contraband. Imani's brain scrambled for words. She had been instructed to keep her internship confidential, as per the strict terms of the confidentiality agreement, but in that moment the badge was her only hope of proving that she was not some random suspect. "It's a government internship ID," she whispered softly. Officer O'Donnell snorted dismissively. "Don't insult our intelligence. This is some fake badge you printed. Do you think you're clever?" Before Imani could protest further, O'Donnell slammed the pouch shut and pocketed the badge. "We'll check this out at the station," he muttered, as Imani was roughly shoved into the back of a squad car. Tears welled up in her eyes. She knew this was very bad. Her mother would be worried sick. Worst of all, Imani feared that she might become yet another statistic, another name on a long list of people of color unfairly detained or harmed by law enforcement. In her mind, she could already envision the sensational headlines. "Honor student charged in robbery." The sound of the officer slamming the car door echoed in her chest like the gavel of a judge. Struggling to breathe, she tried to stay calm, convincing herself that this was all a horrible misunderstanding. A mistake that would soon be cleared once her school attendance records and teacher testimonies were reviewed. Yet, as the squad car drove away, Imani could only see her future slipping away. The future at Howard University, her CIA internship, and the life she had so carefully planned for were now in jeopardy. Hours later, in a blur of humiliation and fear, Imani sat on a cold metal bench at the police precinct. Her cheeks were damp with tears that she tried in vain to wipe away with her shoulder, since her hands remained cuffed behind her back. Officers O'Donnell and Marston drifted in and out of the holding area. Sometimes they sneered at her as they passed, while at other times they remained silent, ignoring her presence entirely. Imani had no inkling of what lay behind that locked door, whether they were searching for evidence of her involvement in the alleged robbery or merely stalling to see if she would break down. Through it all, Imani clung to a desperate hope that, eventually, she would be allowed to make a phone call. Repeating her mother's phone number, 22,555-49-37, like a mantra that she had known since childhood, she waited in a state of anxious anticipation. Finally, an officer whom she had not seen before, a dignified older black woman named Detective Morgan, entered the holding area. With eyes that flickered with a hint of empathy, Detective Morgan said quietly, "All right, Miss Carter, let's get you processed." She reached into her pocket for a key, and Imani let out a tiny sigh of relief as the cuffs were removed, allowing her to be fingerprinted and photographed. Under the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, everything felt surreal, as though Imani were trapped in a waking nightmare. She tried to ask if she could call her mother, but the knot in her throat made it impossible to form the words. Sensing Imani's distress, Detective Morgan gently gestured toward a nearby phone and said, "After we finish here, I'll let you make a call." Those few words felt like a lifeline, and Imani nodded through her tears. Even then, the presence of the other officers, reminding her that as a young black woman she was too easily suspect in their eyes, was inescapable. Once the fingerprinting was completed, Imani was escorted to the phone, where Detective Morgan discreetly stood by, out of earshot. With her heart pounding in her chest, Imani dialed home. On the fourth ring, her mother, Dana, answered. "Hello, Mom?" Imani's voice cracked as she explained haltingly. They arrested me." Dana's gasp echoed over the phone, and Imani could hear her mother's alarmed tone. "Arrested? Imani, what on earth happened? Where are you?" Amid the flurry of her explanation, the store, the police, the false accusation, Dana interrupted urgently. "Stay calm, I'm on my way." "I'll call Mr. Clean immediately." Mr. Clean was an old family friend, a local lawyer with a modest practice who had helped the Carters with legal matters in the past. Although Imani's situation seemed dire, she felt a slight reassurance knowing that help would be arriving within the next few hours. Shortly thereafter, Imani was questioned by Officers O'Donnell and Marston. They insisted that an eyewitness had claimed that someone matching her description had been seen acting suspiciously near the convenience store earlier in the day, and they pointed to her presence near the scene as evidence of potential involvement. Imani repeatedly explained that she had been in school during the time of the alleged robbery, emphasizing her perfect attendance and the numerous teachers who could confirm her whereabouts. However, every explanation was met with scoffs, dismissive eye rolls, and mockery, especially regarding her CIA badge, which the officers derided as a fake. With each attempt to explain, Imani felt as if she was sinking into quicksand. her words swallowed by a system that refused to listen. By midnight, she was utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Detective Morgan returned with a small packet of chips and a bottle of water, wordlessly handing them to Imani. Although the gesture was kind, Imani could not shake the feeling that Morgan still regarded her as just another rebellious teenager, a mere delinquent, despite her calm composure throughout the ordeal. Soon after, Mr. Cleaney arrived, accompanied by Dana. Imani had never felt so relieved to see a familiar face. Dana's usually neat braids were frizzy at the edges, her eyes rimmed with tears, and she rushed forward to embrace Imani. However, a uniformed officer gently stopped her. Imani managed a tight, shaky smile as she caught her mother's gaze from a distance. Mr. Cleaner, a middle-aged white man with a kind yet resolute demeanor, stepped forward. He introduced himself to Detective Morgan and leaned close to Imani, whispering, "Don't say anything else without me present." Imani nodded gratefully. Mr. Clean immediately demanded to see the evidence against her. Officer O'Donnell offered vague references to the so-called eyewitness, and Mr. Clean asked to view the security footage from the convenience store. The officers claimed that the footage was under review, but Imani suspected they were stalling, knowing that the video would not show her at all. Eventually, Imani was formally arrested and charged with suspicion of robbery, with an arraignment scheduled for a few days later. In that moment, the full weight of her predicament struck her. She had never felt so powerless in her life. As Mr. Clean's arms finally enveloped her, Imani broke down in sobs, realizing that she was now entangled in a labyrinth of legal troubles she did not deserve. Detective Morgan escorted Imani to a cell, apologizing because Imani, technically an adult by a few months, had to be housed with other adult female detainees. Some of these other detainees eyed her curiously as she sank onto a bench, clutching her arms in a vain attempt to protect herself. In her mind, she kept returning to the CIA badge. If only she could speak to someone high enough in the agency to confirm her internship status, perhaps all of this could be cleared up. But she also remembered the strict secrecy agreements she had signed. Would the agency even acknowledge her involvement? Would they protect her, or would they distance themselves in order to avoid bad publicity? As the steel cell door clanged shut behind her, Imani stared at the peeling paint on the far wall. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she realized that her worries extended beyond the immediate legal ramifications. She was terrified that her long-awaited acceptance to Howard University might be revoked if she ended up with a criminal record, or that the CIA might terminate her internship in order to avoid any negative media attention. Night stretched on interminably. Imani tried desperately to rest, but every time she drifted off, she was jolted awake by the sound of keys rattling or the shuffling footsteps of other detainees. Her mother's tearful face floated in her mind, fueling fresh waves of despair. Though she fought to hold back her tears in front of strangers, she could not shake the haunting thought. Would tomorrow finally bring the exoneration she so desperately prayed for, or would it only tighten the noose around her neck? 2 days later, Imani found herself in the back seat of a sheriff's van, her hands now cuffed in front of her, on the way to the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse in downtown Washington, D.C., for her arraignment. The courthouse itself had always struck her as grand and imposing, a building she had once admired on school field trips and while exploring the city with her mother. Now, however, she was approaching it in shackles. Despite her mother and Mr. Clean's efforts to secure bail, the judge at the preliminary hearing appeared unconvinced by Imani's persistent protests of innocence, particularly given the prosecution's argument that she was a flight risk due to her questionable government ID. The result was that Imani spent 2 long, harrowing nights in county lockup, a punishing experience for an 18-year-old who had done nothing wrong. During that time, Imani overheard passing comments about Officers O'Donnell and Marston. Some of the older detainees whispered that these officers had a notorious reputation for roughing up suspects and falsifying reports, especially in cases involving young black men and women in Washington, D.C. A new kind of anger began to well up inside her. Imani silently vowed that if she ever managed to extricate herself from this mess, she would do everything in her power to expose the corruption lurking beneath the surface of law enforcement. The previous evening, Mr. Clean had visited Imani in her cell. "I've requested the surveillance footage from the convenience store," he had told her in a low voice, speaking through the security glass. "They claim the footage isn't available because the cameras were out of service. We'll keep digging, There must be another way to prove your alibi. Imani nodded, swallowing hard as she replied, My school records. They'll show I was in class. That's next on my list, Mr. Clean reassured her. I have your attendance log, and we have statements from your teachers, your debate team, and even the bus driver if necessary. The problem is that the prosecution is leaning heavily on the eyewitness account. We'll have to either discredit that witness or prove that he's mistaken or lying. With her forehead pressed against the cold glass, Imani whispered, I'm just scared. What if that isn't enough? Mr. Clean's sympathetic gaze offered her a measure of comfort as they neared the federal courthouse. Outside, Imani could see a swarm of local reporters with cameras stationed near the entrance. Overhearing a deputy mention a high-profile case on the docket, a major political scandal drawing considerable media attention, Imani fervently hoped that none of the reporters would point their cameras at her. The last thing she wanted was to become a media spectacle. Once inside, Imani was led into a sterile hallway where she waited with other detainees for their turn to appear before the judge. In the gallery, her mother, Dana, sat with eyes swollen from crying but with determined hands clasped in her lap. Mr. Clean offered Imani a wordless nod of encouragement. When it was finally her turn, Imani's heart pounded so loudly she was convinced everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Glancing around, she spotted her mother in the front row. As she was escorted to the bench, the judge, a stern-faced woman with a commanding presence, requested that Imani approach with her counsel. The Assistant District Attorney, Miss Branson, an ambitious woman in her late 30s, wasted no time in laying out the charges. The defendant, Imani Carter, is accused of participating in an armed robbery at the convenience store on 3rd and Jefferson, she declared. An eyewitness placed her at the scene and she was seen fleeing shortly after the crime took place. We request that the charges move forward and that bail remain denied given the suspicious nature of the government ID found on her person. The words armed robbery roared in Imani's ears, making her stomach churn. She had never even held a gun in her life. This accusation was madness. Mr. Clean immediately stepped forward, his voice clear and resolute. Your Honor, this is a grave misunderstanding. My client maintains her innocence. She was in school the entire day, engaged in supervised activities, and we have more than a dozen individuals willing to testify to that fact. Furthermore, the ID that Miss Carter possesses is not a fake. She is enrolled in a legitimate government internship, which can be verified. Miss Branson raised an eyebrow and shifted her gaze from Mr. Clean to Imani. Verified by whom? She pressed. The defendant refuses to name the contact who provided this so-called CIA badge. Imani's stomach clenched as she tried to explain. I wanted to tell you about my CIA contact. A liaison named Miss Harrington who oversaw the high-potential outreach program, but I was made to sign documents stating I would never reveal program specifics without prior agency approval. She recalled that she had called Miss Harrington from jail, only to receive voicemail in return. In desperation, she had left a whispered message, hoping that someone within the agency would step forward. The judge tapped her gavel lightly and stated, I will not deny that this is an unusual situation. However, Ms. Carter is only 18, has no prior record, and appears to have strong ties to this community. I am inclined to grant bail if the defense can provide credible verification of her identity and internship. Mr. Clean cleared his throat. We request a short recess, Your Honor, so that we may gather additional verification. After a moment's consideration, the judge agreed. Very well. We will reconvene in 2 days. Miss Carter will remain in custody until then, unless the defense can provide immediate proof of her CIA affiliation or an assurity bond. With that, Imani was guided out of the courtroom, tears burning in her eyes. Her mother, Dana, tried to rush forward, but security held her back. Imani's heart sank further. She was so close to being released, yet still trapped in a cage. Every passing day felt like another piece of her future crumbling away. Back in the holding area, Imani was exhausted. She rested her head in her hands, trying to block out the humiliating clangs of the jail cell gate. Amid her despair, she resolved that she had to find a way to contact someone from the CIA to intervene. The thought that the agency might not want to draw public attention to a minor operative or intern with minimal clearance filled her with dread. However, her break finally came late that evening when a guard roused her, saying she had a visitor. Rubbing her eyes, Imani walked to the visitation room. Behind the plexiglass, she saw a woman in a crisp navy suit with her hair tied in a tight bun. Recognition lit Imani's eyes. This was Miss Harrington, her CIA liaison. Without hesitation, Imani slid into the seat and picked up the phone receiver. "Miss Harrington," she said, her voice subdued. "I just heard what happened." "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner." Imani pressed her free hand to the glass and whispered, "Thank God you came. They think I robbed that store. They won't believe my ID is real. They're charging me with armed robbery." Miss Harrington's voice was gentle as she replied, "Please, you have to help me. I'm going to do everything I can," Miss Harrington continued. "This is a delicate matter. I've been authorized to confirm your internship to the judge, but that's about it. This is not how we like to handle such issues, but given the circumstances, your freedom is more important. You should never have been arrested in the first place." Imani exhaled slowly, tears of relief welling up as she wanted nothing more than to grasp Miss Harrington's hand, but the plexiglass barrier made that impossible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Please hurry." The following day brought a glimmer of hope. Imani was informed that Miss Harrington had provided a formal affidavit verifying her participation in the CIA's High Potential Outreach program. The affidavit even included Imani's acceptance letter, with sensitive content appropriately redacted. With this official documentation in hand, Mr. Clean demanded an emergency hearing. The judge, swayed by the evidence, granted Imani bail. As she emerged onto the courthouse steps, her mother enveloped her in a fierce hug that took Imani's breath away. Reporters milling about captured a few pictures of Imani and her mother, but Imani did her best to keep her head down. All she wanted was to go home, take a hot shower, and sleep in her own bed. Yet, even as she walked away with Dana, Imani knew the battle was far from over. She would soon have to return for a full hearing, with the official trial scheduled for the following week. Later that evening, in the worn living room of her temporary jail lodging, Imani sat on a tattered couch with Mr. Clean and Dana. A stack of paperwork lay spread out on the coffee table as Dana offered Mr. Clean a cup of coffee. With a tired smile, Mr. Clean explained the plan gently, stirring in some sugar. "The prosecution is building their entire case on this alleged eyewitness testimony, combined with the fact that you were near the store at the time. We will counter with your school attendance statements, affidavits from your teachers, and the fact that you only got off the bus near the store by sheer coincidence. We can also present the time logs from the bus route and the sign-out sheet from your debate meeting. Most importantly, we will emphasize Miss Harrington's affidavit confirming that your CIA internship is real, which diffuses the argument that your ID was fake. However, we must poke holes in their eyewitness's story. The store cameras were reportedly broken, leaving the eyewitness as the only link to the prosecution's case. If we can discredit him or prove he is mistaken, their case might collapse." Imani listened intently, her eyes shifting between Mr. Cleany and her mother. Dana squeezed Imani's hand in moral support, as Imani's heart pounded at the thought of going through a full trial with testimonies and cross-examinations. Deep down, she knew that this was her only chance to clear her name. Amid these plans, there loomed another critical question: her CIA affiliation. Although the agency had helped secure her bail, Imani was uncertain how far they would go beyond that. Miss Harrington had advised her to keep the badge hidden from the media, but Imani sensed that once she took the stand, every detail of her internship would be laid bare. The thought filled her with apprehension, yet she also felt a surge of resolve. She was not merely fighting for her own freedom, she was fighting for her future, and for the principle that justice should not be derailed by prejudice. She vowed silently that once she cleared her name, she would ensure that Officers O'Donnell and Marston were held accountable for their actions. The day of the trial arrived in a haze of tension and hope. Imani woke up that morning with her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She dressed in a simple navy blouse and black pants while her mother fussed over her hair, determined to ensure every curl was neat. The entire ride to the courthouse was silent, except for Imani's shaky breathing and Dana's anxious fiddling with her purse. Outside, Imani noticed the same group of reporters who had earlier been focused on the political scandal, a few of whom now recognized her as the so-called teen CIA imposter, a sensational headline some tabloid had run the previous day. Flashes went off, and instinctively Imani ducked her head and pressed forward into the building. In the hallway, Mr. Clean greeted them, his eyes reflecting both readiness and concern. "Are you ready?" he asked, though he could see the fear in Imani's eyes. She nodded, swallowing hard. The three of them entered the courtroom, which was moderately full. Imani's eyes briefly met those of Miss Harrington, who was seated unobtrusively at the back, providing her with a small measure of reassurance. Soon the judge entered and everyone rose as a mark of respect. Once seated, Miss Branson, the assistant district attorney, wasted no time in giving her opening statement. She portrayed Imani as a cunning young woman who had lied about her government credentials and exploited her youth to evade suspicion, orchestrating a robbery that had netted a few $1,000s from the convenience store's register. Miss Branson then called Officer O'Donnell to testify about the arrest. With an air of righteous indignation, Officer O'Donnell described how Imani had been loitering suspiciously near the crime scene, how she had attempted to flee, and how she had produced what he claimed was a fake CIA badge during questioning. Listening to his testimony, Imani's hands balled into fists beneath the table. She remembered how, despite her efforts to remain calm and comply to avoid escalation, O'Donnell's narrative painted her as hostile and deceptive. Next, Miss Branson called the eyewitness, a middle-aged man named Travis Brown, who wore a rumpled shirt and shifted his eyes nervously. Imani studied him carefully. She had never seen this man before. Under Miss Branson's prompting, Brown stated that he had seen Imani dash out of the store right after the robbery alarm sounded. Imani's heart pounded. This was a blatant lie. She had never even entered that store on the day in question.